Hello, beautiful people and beautiful dogs. So many dogs. We're even going to have a dog on stage. I feel like we've peaked at Radical Book Fair now. Welcome to Reframing Resistance, Strategies for Change. My name is Mary. I run Lighthouse and the Radical Book Fair, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to Saturday afternoon with these wonderful people. I'm going to do a quick introduction to our speakers, and then you're going to put your hands together and welcome them. They're going to come out, they're going to have a chat, then there will be time for your questions. Any questions that come in online as well, we will field those. And then there will be a wee book signing up at the back near the bar. And if you don't get a chance to ask a question, you'll be able to do that then and come and speak to speakers. Because they all have very esteemed and quite long, brilliant biographies, bear with me. We'll start with the digital ones. Yes. The wonderful Rachel Charlton-Dailey is an award-winning disabled journalist, activist, and author, a columnist at the Canary. She has previously reported for the BBC, The Unwritten, The Big Issue, Metro, Guardian, and Daily Mirror. When Rachel isn't writing, they can be found walking their sausage dog Rusty, who will be making a guest appearance today. Sam Goncalves is a Brazilian writer and documentary filmmaker based in Glasgow. His work has appeared in The National, Counterpoint, and The Skinny, and he publishes a bi-monthly interview on Everything Mixtape. Janet cannot be with us today, but we are incredibly lucky to have her co-author, Dan. Dan has over 2 decades of experience as an educator, writer, political journalist, and lyricist, and holds a master's degree in international relations. Finally, our chair for today, the wonderful Q, is an anthropologist of caring narrations of authoritarian resistance movements. They won the Cavia Prize for Scottish Writers of Colour in 2023 and co-convened the Palestine Solidarity Group of the Scottish Greens, with whom they are now a lead candidate for the 2026 Scottish Parliament elections for Edinburgh and Lothian. Would everyone in the room please put your hand together for today's speakers?
Hi, everyone. Now that the particularly important folks on the stage are well settled, and we're glad for all of you here, and we're happy to be in this particular space where these excellent authors have unique contributions in terms of the different textures of resistance that we've seen over the past few years. I think we can all agree that we are at an interesting stage in the world, one that is a space of both hope as well as one of immense grief. And in that space, where better than here in the Radical Book Fair, and what better to discuss than tactics and strategies of resistance. So to start with, I'm not going to take any more of our time with rhetoric. Let's go to the authors themselves to introduce both themselves in the ways that they want to best, as well as their work. Should we start with Sam, perhaps?
So thank you so much. Thanks for having me, folks. So I wrote How Does Change Happen? It's an inkling with 404 Inc. It's a series of profiles on people that are attempting to make change through a movement, through a union, through some kind of campaign. And it's just this kind of like conversations I've had with people, kind of listening to the stories, asking them the title question of the book. It came as a bit of, just a kind of personal frustration with the slow pace of change happening. I came across this anecdote that I put in the first, right in the introduction of the book, about Umbrella Man. I don't know if anyone ever heard of Umbrella Man. He's a character in the JFK assassination. And, there's the video of the JFK assassination, and when people were looking over that, there's a guy with it was a sunny summer day in Texas, and there's a guy in the crowd with a black suit and an open umbrella. And people were seeing this on the video, and no one knew, what, he was kind of off. And we were like, could he be, it's right where the shooting started, so they're like, could he be involved in the plot? There were congressional sketches drawn of how you could hide a gun inside an umbrella or whatever. And then it turned out that he came forward. It was a guy called Stephen Witt who said that he was at the parade that Kennedy was coming through. And the reason he was there was to protest, and let me walk you through his protest. He was protesting JFK's father because of his association with Neville Chamberlain, because of his association with Adolf Hitler 20 years before that day. And so, it's just fascinating. They took him to a congressional hearing because they were, there was a lot of suspicions on this guy. And he has a quote in the records that's like, if there was a Guinness record for someone who was at the worst place at the worst time doing the worst thing, I would have gotten number one. And I relate to Umbrella Man quite a bit, just in that sense of, I feel like I've seen so much of this, era of protest and resistance from the Iraq War to Occupy to independence to so much more. And yet, feeling frustrated about how change is happening. And so the book came from asking people who are wiser and more experienced than me to answer that question and speak to that frustration.
No, that's perfect. And I think for any of you who've already read the book or who are yet to, I think you'll see the collection of stories. You often ask, is there a connecting loop between it? And you kind of address it in the conclusion as well as the beginning. But I think the underlying thread for me was that they were very distinct. Was that these were essentially strategies that were creative and that yet were unique to their time and location. Strategies which so often now movements often struggle to incorporate because we follow set patterns of resistance. But we'll get back to that. Dan, if you want.
Yeah, thank you. So the book, Defiance, I wrote with Janet Alder, it's really her story of her campaign to find out what happened to her police who was killed by, her brother, was killed by Humberside police in 1998 in Hull. And it's really been a sort of quarter century battle for her to find out what went on and try and bring some kind of accountability. I first met her just after her brother was killed in around about 2001 when I was studying at Sussex University. And the film had just come out then by Migrant Media by Ken Ferro and Tariq Mahmood. Injustice, which follows the families of about 7 or 8 people who've been killed by the police. It's a phenomenal film. Has anyone seen it? Injustice. It's a fantastic film. You should all go and watch it. It's on Vimeo, on Migrant Media channel on Vimeo. It was due for a cinematic release, and but actually, what happened? The Police Federation threatened to sue any cinema that showed it for incitement to riot. And so it got pulled from all the cinemas, and so instead it kind of toured around community centres and student unions. And our student union, we booked it, and Ken, the director, came down and he brought Janet along to do the Q&A afterwards. And we kept in touch ever since, and I've written for various publications over the years, interviewed her a couple of times about developments in her campaign over the years. And I did a series on police brutality and deaths in custody, police killings. It's a euphemism, really, deaths in custody. We try to avoid that phrase now. Police killings, extrajudicial killings, call these things by their name. Yeah, and she really liked the piece, and she said, "Look, I want to bring out a book about the whole story." And it was nearly 10 years in the making, but we got there. We got there in the end, and we're very, very pleased to get it out.
Oh, it really is an exceptional document. So for those of you who haven't yet read Defiance, it's about basically a biographical story, but also one that documents Janet's efforts towards fighting for justice for her brother, Christopher Alder, who was a victim of a custodial killing in Britain, despite having been a state trooper for the British state, despite being a decorated service worker. And despite all of these factors which seemingly offer a degree of protection, there was a systematic cover-up of the killing. And Janet and Dan weave biography in artful ways to not just speak of the grief and the struggle towards justice, but also the ways in which personal identity, the way one's childhoods, the way one's ideas and hopes and dreams feed into that idea of resistance. And I think it's beautifully done, and I can't wait to discuss it more. Rachel, if you want to.
Can you hear me? Yeah, there we go. So I'm the author of Ramping Up Rights, an unfinished history of British disability activism, which is a subtitle I have to think about every single time I say it to make sure I get it right. I work in disability rights. I do a lot of stuff as a journalist. I do a lot of stuff around benefits. I do a lot of stuff around the different ways disabled people are treated in the media. And it was when I was at an event, I was talking to Barbara Lisicki, who was responsible for a lot of the protests around transport and protests to get the Disability Discrimination Act into power. I was talking at an event with her, and I realised that despite me doing all of this stuff around modern disability rights, I really didn't know a lot about where we'd been and what had happened over, like, you know, up until about 100 years ago. I didn't really know anything about that. So I wanted to really discover that, and I wanted to go back and do it for me, but I also wanted to do it for people both growing up now, because I spent a long, long time not being able to even say I was disabled, never mind fight for my rights. But I also wanted to do it for the people who are trying to fight now, because I think a big reason that the government are able to do everything that they do around disability benefits, around the many different ways that disabled people are treated badly, is because disabled people feel isolated, and they don't realise there's such a big community. They don't realise that there's so many other disabled people fighting for them. So I wanted to highlight all of the different groups, but I also wanted to highlight all of the ways that you can still fight now, and all of the ways that people are not alone in this fight, because it feels, when you've got ableism happening, coming at you from the media, the government, and you're just trying to stay alive, you do feel really alone. So I wanted more than anything, this book is a history book, but it's also a love letter to all of the different organisations who fight for us every single day.
Thank you so much, Rachel. I'll maybe start with you for the questions that I had for you all. And I think one, we discussed a few of the kinds of themes and registers in which we will have these conversations around. And one of them was how our textures of resistance and, well, resisting violence and authoritarianism, to start with, have changed over the past few years and even longer. And I think each of your books, as we previously mentioned, operates in a slightly different context, albeit intersecting in their own ways. So to start with, I remember one of the anecdotes in your books was of a person called Claire looking at jobs in the DWP. There were thousands of jobs in the first search, and then you had to narrow them down to disability-friendly employers, and there was even lower.
So there's somebody called Claire who lives in Stockton-on-Tees, and she now works for Difference North East. But at the time, she didn't have a job because she was struggling to find a job, and so she went on the Find a Job website, and that is what replaced Job Centre Plus. And she searched for any job first of all. Then she narrowed it down to disability confident, and it got lower. And then she narrowed it down to fully remote, and it got lower. And I do this every few months. It usually starts off with 100,000, but then if you keep going, and you whittle it down. So the parameters that me and Claire do now is disability confident, part-time, and remote. And usually you get less than 10 jobs in the whole of the UK. But Claire did this for her specific area. And she found 4. And then what she found was, from that, those 4, because remote work replaced what they called home working, those 4 were actually in care homes. So they weren't even jobs that were that she could do. So for all the government go on and on and on about how disabled people should just be working and they're all being lazy scroungers, what jobs? What bloody jobs are we supposed to do? There's none there.
No, absolutely. And in spaces like that where you struggle against institutions and governments that refuse to acknowledge lived experiences and what it really means for a home working job versus what, by definition, it's supposed to be by the institution. When do you decide to work with an institution, work with the government, work with the legislature, such as you discussed the assisted buying bill as well, which has been a topic of conversation, very rightly so, particularly for disabled people, and the concerns surrounding it, and the fact that there still exist concerns about it, and those concerns need to be fought for the foreseeable future. So when is it that one chooses to fight and work with institutions, and when does one seek non-institutional sources of support and refuge? And I know that both are usually necessary at all points, but
So-
how's it been?
So something that's always been, sorry, I am fighting with a dog, you'll be able to see here. Something that's always been prevalent in the disability movement, which I think we do need to go back to now, is there's always been the direct action movement, and there's always been those who work with government. And work with government is perhaps not the right phrase, but they will go into meetings, they will try and find out as much information, they will try and influence as much as possible, but it's really hard. Like, I've got a lot of criticisms of disabled people's organisations at the moment because they're still working quite a lot, and I can see why, but they're still working quite a lot around the benefits cuts, and I can completely see why, because they want to be in the room, they want it to be led by disabled people. They want it to be co-produced. But one of my criticisms this whole time has been how can you not see that you're blurring the lines between co-produced and colluding? Because that is really what it feels like, and I can see why they want to do it. I can really see why, but I've got a lot of criticism for working with the government, and it's not something that I would ever do. But it's not something that they'd ever let me do because I'm far too sweary, more than anything. I'm really surprised I haven't swore yet, to be honest with you.
Well, I was going to say feel free, but
Shall I just drop on right now? Shall I just say? I'm just going to say fuck, because it was just in the back of my head. I was going, I need to say fuck. I need to say fuck. I need to say fuck. Sorry, I'm really sorry if there are any children.
Scotland, it's all right.
Sorry.
Dan. Moving on to you, and to defiance again. I have so many questions, and one of the things I wanted to touch upon is the politics of testament, of how when Janet had to provide, there's almost the need to provide a particular order of events to conform to an official chronology, and how that kind of sticking to set timeline of events is so very often different from the timelines of grief, from the timelines of violence that people experience, loved ones experience. And I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about defiance and how the book itself is a form of testament, but it also documents testament in so many wonderful ways. So through the process of writing it, through your conversations with Janet, how has that idea of testament looped into our notions of resistance, or your notions of resistance?
Yeah, it's interesting. The original idea we had for writing the book was that it would be kind of interspersed chapters that would be written in Janet's voice, first person, which would be kind of relaying what she was going through at the time, what she was being told by the police at the time, and so on, and finding out, and then kind of interspersed with more kind of third-person journalistic chapters, which would kind of put together what we now know was going on behind the scenes from, over the years collected evidence from court cases and so on, to really kind of juxtapose, what Janet was being told with the reality of, evidence being destroyed behind the scenes and these kinds of things, and illegal surveillance, all the things that have over the years been unearthed. Yeah, I mean, there was a couple of. I didn't want it to come across like, here's the black woman in her emotion, and here's the objective white man in his third-person objective God's eye view, bringing the truth to the situation. So we were going to be clear, like, all of this is Janet's analysis. I'm kind of just writing it up, really. But it's okay. We can deal with that. We can deal with that. But it was in the end, it was just too much. It was like it was going to be twice. It was going to be a big, heavy tome, and we just, something had to go. So we just cut all the third-person chapters, and we just put it all together. And so it's kind of written kind of like a memoir now. But I think, in terms of that process, Janet's found it very cathartic, I think. And it's interesting, she wanted to be here, and she's done a few events like this. In the end, it was just a bit far. We've done a few recently, and it's quite, it can be re-traumatizing to kind of go through this stuff again as well. And so I think for Janet, it was nice. And I always say to her, remember, you don't have to go through, you don't have to. The book's there now. If people want to know all the gory details, is there. You don't have to feel like every time you're on stage you have to kind of relay everything and everything that the police have done and so on to you and your brother. So I think that's been very useful in terms of that, testimony and documentation. but the purpose really, Janet and me, but the purpose for both of us really for writing the book was to really expose the state, its racism, and its anti-working class nature built in, and expose the kind of subtle mechanisms by which impunity is upheld, because it is the oldest ruling class in the world here, really, isn't it? Arguably the British ruling class, and they've got a lot of tricks. And so there's the illusion of the rule of law. There are processes, and the reports that the police produce, they're thick reports. You'd think, they've gone into everything, haven't they? And that's one of the kind of tricks of the British state. It will go into all of the minute detail on all the irrelevant stuff, but then the real key stuff, it's just not there. And so, like I said, there was destruction of evidence. There was a tooth. Christopher he'd been attacked. He'd been in a fight outside a nightclub, and he was arrested. Actually, not as he was actually being interviewed in the hospital as a victim of an assault, because he'd been punched. He did have some minor injuries. The doctor assessed them as pretty minor. They couldn't take an X-ray. He was behaving erratically, which is a common consequence of a head injury. And then, of course, when the police came, supposedly to take his testimony as a victim, of course, they just escalated everything as they do. And you see when you read the report, the doctors are kind of doing their best, and nurse to kind of calm him down, and the police immediately just ramp everything up again. So he left without getting an X-ray. But the interesting thing, which is very unusual in these cases, they took detailed records of all of the injuries from the fight, and then of course you could compare then with the post-mortem report the following day, which says all of these additional injuries that he'd incurred after leaving hospital, after being arrested. And they arrested him on very spurious grounds, which they couldn't really even agree what they were themselves afterwards when they're being interviewed. But he was seen by the security guard of the hospital, walking unaided, perfectly fine. His consciousness level when he left the hospital was assessed as 14 out of 15 on the scale they used. He'd had like a pint or two, so that was the reason for 14 rather than 15. But he stepped into the ambulance completely unaided. And then the next thing you see that finally, after 2 years, the family were finally allowed to see the CCTV footage from the custody suite. And he's dragged in. He's unconscious. He's bleeding from the mouth. He's got bigger injuries. He's lost an additional tooth. We know now. So obviously something's happened in that van ride. All of the evidence that was meticulously collected, the blood samples from the van. They said they had a tooth in their possession. And they said how they got this tooth. They said, this tooth was the tooth that he lost because he did lose a tooth in the fight outside the nightclub. They said, that tooth, it was thrown in the bin outside the nightclub. So what we did, we searched but it had been taken from the bin to the landfill site. We sent a crew of police. They found it in the landfill site. Yeah, that's the claim. And then, so they went to all that effort to literally find a needle in a haystack, and then they destroyed the tooth without testing it. And they destroyed the blood samples without testing it. Everything that would have implicated or maybe exonerated the officers was all destroyed without testing. But yeah, I mean, we think it probably wasn't the tooth from outside the nightclub. It was a tooth someone had picked up in the custody suite floor that they then needed to bring up some cock and bull story about where it came from. Anyway, I could go on and on, but you can read the book for that. But the point being to expose the state, and like I say, these subtle, it's not very subtle destruction of evidence, is it? But the report, the processes of there was a whole. Eventually, it took 4 years of campaigning by the family and their supporters. Eventually, the police officers did actually go on trial. And the way that the CPS, who'd had to be dragged kicking and screaming to bring in manslaughter charges, deliberately through that trial is also it's a sort of exercise in understanding how these mechanisms work. So it's really about that. And we always say, the state has impunity under its own processes. You're not going to get any justice or accountability through the state's own processes. But really the message to people confronting police injustice or even, God forbid, murder. But there are about one so-called death in custody per week still in this country, police custody, is really to not trust any of those processes. And the phrase, there ain't no justice, there's just us. But just us is quite a lot. And actually, really, I think the message of the story really is Janet, her determination, and the campaign and her supporters. Actually, they have brought some measure of accountability just by their sheer dogged persistence in shining a light on these things. So, yeah, anyway, I've spoken too much.
No, that was perfect. And the fact that we continue to fight still for Christopher's justice is something that I think everyone in this audience, particularly after reading the book, can perhaps help out with. Sam, I think in terms of the stories that I was reading in your book, there's one of Tim who sewed his mouth shut as an act of defiance against lack of climate action as well as just protest suppression as a whole. And there was Yana, who worked at Blood Class, but then chose to stay there because despite being an institution that had its problems, it would mean that there is a space of refuge and comfort for anyone who continues to associate with it. Whilst being two different cases altogether, I was very interested by the fact that you wrote that Tim, despite going through such an extreme act of sewing his mouth shut with a large fiber, which is incredibly painful and incredibly harsh, he did not believe that it had the impact that he had hoped. And I felt that was both not a bit saddening, absolutely, but also interesting and not to be clinical, but also in terms of us thinking about the kinds of ways in which we go through things. Because for someone to have gone through such an incredible act, it must have taken a lot for that admission. So when we're thinking of our strategies of resistance, of whether we're staying in institutions or whether we're going into extreme forms of, symbolic or direct action, what are the ways in which we can assess the ways in which our protest actions are most effective? And if not, is effectiveness the standard we should be using for our tactics and strategies?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So Tim Hughes, that you're mentioning, he is 74. When I spoke to him, he used to be a dentist and is now doing protest actions with Insulate Britain and Just Stop Oil and other groups. He did a solo action outside News Corp, where the Daily Mail and the Sun are kind of based, and he sewed his lips shut outside of the building. He used carpet upholstery because he knew that just thread wouldn't show on the camera. And it was a protest around climate, and it was talking about how the press and how the kind of Murdoch press has been silent on the climate crisis. It's really fascinating because I spoke to Tim and I spoke to a few organizers around him who are in their 70s and 80s doing this kind of protest, civil disobedience action. And I asked a lot about effectiveness because I think it's important to ask that question and to have a good assessment of what we're doing ends up in. The Insulate Britain and the Just Stop Oil activists that I spoke to would always mention the radical flank effect that I'm sure people are familiar with, but the idea is that if they stop the motorway somewhere and the traffic is stopped and there are cars watching Just Stop Oil do an action, the research has shown that they won't be turned against climate activism or climate concerns. Research has shown that they'll be moved to join more moderate groups like Friends of the Earth. So if you witness a very extreme climate action, you don't say, I don't care about the climate anymore. You say, I should do something about the climate. It won't be this, but it will be something. And so it actually has had a positive impact, and that's something that I kept hearing from them. I think from this group, the specific answer was also what else am I going to do? They are mostly retired and they feel like they need to leave something behind for other generations. So they're kind of, in a funny way, glib about this. Like Tim told me this harrowing story of sewing his lips shut, and then the second half of the story was about how he accidentally ate salt and vinegar crisps after. And he's just telling it like it's a funny story, And I think that the response is that they're always like, if everyone does this, if everyone sat on the motorway, things would change from night to day. But until they don't, this is more of an inkling for change. And I think that's one of the big takeaways from the book is the diversity of strategy that's needed in a movement, and that actually the having people out in the streets, civil disobedience, high energy thing is extremely important at the start. And that needs to then transform into organized ways and strong organizations and things that will consistently keep the powers that be to account. So I think there's and it's funny how they understand that. Sue Parfit, who is another activist that I wrote about in the book, talks about this. We are not gluing ourselves to the motorway because we think that this is how change happens, but we think this is a branch in the tree of change. And if we can ignite, if this kind of presence in the street can ignite something more present, powerful, resilient, organized as we go forward, that's what it's meant to do. And I think that's just a lovely thought that when I'm going to a protest, I'm not thinking this is it. I'm going to be at the city square today holding a sign and this is how the dominoes fall, Actually, this is part of it. And it needs a much bigger, and it needs all of us, and yeah.
That was perfect. Wow. I wish I was that articulate. Let's move into some audience questions before we have some final concluding remarks. I think I'm supposed to hand my mic over to somebody, but I will wait for that.
Is that going to go? Oh, okay.
Sorry, where were the hands? I was sure I saw yes. There's a yes.
Thank you. I was wondering, so a couple of you talked about how we can't rely on the state for justice. How would you go about approaching justice, a stateless justice? I'm just interested in your perspectives.
For me, it's something that has to be led by, so I wouldn't necessarily say completely stateless, but at the same time, it has to be something that, like I've already spoken about, has to be co-produced with the groups that are affected by it. So if it's something to do with disability, it's got to be co-produced with disabled people, and it's got to be that they want to genuinely work with us instead of just working with us for tokens. So if they want to do more, if they want to genuinely do more around issues facing black people, or if they want to genuinely do things, even stuff like the Hillsborough inquiry and stuff like that, the big criticism of people around the Hillsborough Families for Justice is that Labour were all for working with them, and they made this huge point of working with them up until the point they got into government. So, and Labour did that a lot, they worked with disabled people for years and years and years, and then they got in government and they went, oh no, we can't do that anymore, sorry. So it's, if you do want to work with us, you've got to work with us authentically, and not just, more than anything, to score points as opposition, because that seemed like, to be honest, all Labour really gave a fuck about doing. They everything they've done in opposition to do with disabled people's rights, to do with the very small things they cared about, to do with race and LGBTQ rights, all of that was always to be done to score points against the Tories. So I think if the state wants us to believe that they genuinely do care about us, they need to fucking show it, instead of just using us as tokens. And only then will we genuinely want to work with them. Because at the minute, I don't see why any minority group would want to work with this government.
I'll just add something to that. I mean, for me, justice is about making sure there's no impunity. There's no impunity. It means there are consequences. Yeah. It's not only the state who can exact consequences, the people can exact consequences. Absolutely. Reputational consequences by exposing the actions of wrongdoers, corporations, in the case with Janet, the police, the council, etc. Financial consequences, just an example. I'm not being neutral, but just an example. Palestine Action said, didn't they, that any business, doing business with Elbit Systems will face consequences. to their property and so on. And political consequences as well. I'm not really particularly interested in electoral politics, but sometimes particularly on very local levels. If there's a local decision maker, council, something like that, if a united community can really show they're really dead against something, there might be consequences in terms of come election time. So yeah, for me, it's not about begging the state to exact consequences. It's actually taking the power and exacting some ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, you guys covered it. I think that's it. It's using power as opposed to doing a kind of campaign to get someone who seems sympathetic into power and then waiting for them to do it. But yeah, using power to kind of leverage what you want to happen with that government. But, yeah.
Absolutely. Are there any more in the room? There's one online while you gather up your courage to ask the next question. This one is from Braya, who says, are you seeing intergenerational activism, voices and wisdom flowing both up from youth and down from elders? And if so, where?
Yeah.
I mean, I think in the kind of climate justice movement, you see a lot of that. You see, in fact, it's kind of funny how you see a lot of activists in their late teens, early 20s, and then you see a lot of activists in their 70s and 80s, which seems like it's a very poetic balance of groups. And there's a lot of I think there's a lot of kind of covering each other. And, when you see, so Sue Parfit was recently arrested for supporting Palestine Action. And there's something that she does about this, me getting arrested is more of a headline that could, knock dominoes to get people to pay attention than if it was someone in their 20s who can just be painted as like an extremist or a kid who doesn't know what they're doing. When it's her and she has the priest, like the dog collar and, the whole thing, that has a bigger impact. So I've seen a lot of that kind of solidarity of what can you do that's more effective than what our generation can do and vice versa. It's been really interesting.
Yeah, it's been pretty interesting to see. There's been a lot of online activism come out recently, and the insurgence of online activism, and that's been really interesting because a lot of especially, and I'm going to keep talking about the disability groups because that's my thing, but a lot of the disability groups are run by the older people, and for a long time they really struggled to make the numbers and make the impact online. So what was great, especially around this spring and the benefits cuts and everything, is that a lot of newer people joined the movement, but also they brought the tools that meant we could have online protests, we could have live stream protests, we could do actions both online and in person, and we could really skill share in that sort of thing. And another point that I wanted to bring up was talking about Palestine Action. The ones that have made the headlines have been 79-year-old person in wheelchair pulled out of their wheelchair to be arrested, and that was deliberate. Like they knew, like you say, if I go to this protest where I'm very obviously visibly disabled and they have to arrest me, that's going to make such a big. I mean, they don't have to, but you know what I mean. That's going to make such a bigger impact than somebody in their 30s or their 20s who doesn't look visibly disabled. So that was something that was coordinated, and it was something. But then at the same time, the people in their 20s and their 30s have been letting the older people take a back seat in places where they don't have to be expending all their energy. And that's been really lovely to see as well, like just people actually working together for a common good. And it's not just been in disabled people's movement, it's been in across the things to do with Palestine. Like people have been people from different groups lending their support and going, okay, we've got different struggles, but they're still systemic power struggles. So how can we work together to raise each other's voices? And that's been wonderful to see as well, like the cross solidarity of the different movements.
Yeah. 2 secs.
Thank you all so much. My question is, particularly in a time where ordinary people are really struggling materially, if we no longer have faith in the state and we choose to organize in community against its interests, what kinds of strategies can we use to protect ourselves against the increasing and crushing power of the state with all its influence and technology and surveillance?
That's a tough one. Does anybody else want to take that first one, I think? Because that's a really tough one. Yeah, no, you go.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's fast becoming the number one question of our age, I think. I mean, I think one of the questions, I'm trying to remember exactly one of the possible questions you put to us before was about, why is it important to have conversations about resistance? And I was thinking, well, it's fast becoming, it's not really even a choice. I mean, subsistence, let alone resistance, subsistence is becoming a struggle that you can sometimes not even meet, even working full time, increasingly for many people. So, resistance is becoming more and more of a necessity. But yeah, you're right. The state has been tooling up ready for this moment and the moments to come. And I was at, some of the Police Powers Act in the last couple of years, and there's a kind of analysis that this is a reaction against like XR, direct action from XR and BLM and so on, kind of backlash. And I don't think it is. I think it's the excuse. I think they know that actually there's a fairly reactionary chunk of the population who can be mobilized against those groups. But actually, it's aimed at all of us. It's aimed at the coming mass unrest that will be far beyond the kind of usual suspects who we normally associate with resistance, because of just the increasing difficulties of survival. So it's about those legal tools and police powers. They're getting them all in place, not just for Palestine action and so on, but for the whole population, right? So. But yeah, and it's difficult. You'd have to ask someone younger than me about internet security and this kind of stuff. But yeah, I mean, I'm not sure there's a general answer to that question. I think there's a lot of specific technical answers that we all need to get skilled up on quite quickly, really, to be honest with you. We did a squat in Oxford. Didn't last very long because, again, since 2012, it's criminally illegal to occupy residential buildings. So we've got beautiful residential buildings that have been empty for decades, just begging to be squatted, where we can't do it. But there was a games hall, a council-run sports centre that we took for a few weeks. And we were very fortunate to have some experienced squatters to sort of advise us on the legalities and ins and outs and so on. I think that, like I said, I'm not sure there's a generic answer. I think just find the people with experience, and let's kind of get a bit skilled up and a bit knowledgeable, because we're going to have to.
I think more than anything, it's about sticking together, and it's because it's really, really hard when it comes to. It's really, really hard when you are the ones who are standing up, and you feel like a lot of others, maybe, So say you're in a really working class area, and you're one of the ones who's labelled as an agitator because you're constantly going, no, that's wrong. We shouldn't be doing that. You need to, I think, more than anything, it's about educating the people around us, but also not making yourself the enemy of other working class people. So, all of this stuff that's continuously happening, and it's coming out of the media about disabled people, about immigrants, about bloody trans people, all the rest of it. It's designed to make us all squabble among the working class, and that's what they bloody want. So I think it's really easy to go off at your dad and be like, no, that's wrong, you stupid sun-reading racist bigot. It's really easy to do that. It's far harder to go, okay, I can, after all of the things you have faced and how awful it's been for the working class, I can, I can't see why you think some of the fucking awful things you think, but at the same time, I can see where that has come from. So it's much harder to actually sit and try and drill it into people than it is to just completely turn against each other. And I think that's the last thing we need to be doing right now, turning against the working class, because at the end of the day, that's what everybody at the top wants, so that we're not looking up. And that's probably not the right answer, but what came to my head.
I think from the interviews that I've done, most of the people that I talked to would come back to this theme of resilient organizations, and organizations that can withstand that power of the state and the surveillance and the pushback. One of the groups I spoke to was the landless workers movement in Brazil, which is a fascinating group that organized rural workers, started 40 years ago, and it essentially organized rural workers to use this legal constitutional loophole in Brazil to take over land that didn't serve a social good. So land that was being used for slave work, land that was being used for pollution, land that was abandoned, take over that land and through a legal process then own that land as a movement, as a union almost, and live in that land and build schools in that land. And they have representation now across the country in every single state of Brazil. And they're the largest producers of organic food in Brazil, which is really interesting. So now, like, there was a huge flood in the southernmost state of Brazil last year, and the government didn't have the resources to help people who were affected by the flood, but the landless workers movement did. And more resources than the national government. And they engage in protests, they engage in legislative battles, they engage in education. They taught hundreds of thousands of adults to read and write. And all of that from building this cohesive, strong movement that then a person like Bolsonaro can become president and on a campaign to outlaw the landless workers movement. And they withstand him and they stick around, So I think there's something about building movements, seeing activism as more than a marketing campaign and more of a belonging group that can withstand the state. There was a piece, I just read it this morning, by Rosie Hampton, who wrote a piece on the New Internationalist about left-wing spaces in the UK and how we're kind of missing those, with the erosion of the kind of strong history of unions that we've had in this country since the 80s, with the erosion of like this kind of public belonging places and organizations, we're kind of losing the kind of leftist space that people can just go and belong to and socialize and learn and share ideas. And I think the kind of common theme that I heard from everyone is we need to build those spaces. We need to build that kind of room for solidarity in politics in a left movement that goes beyond just campaign and marketing and saying things on the public square.
There was another question online, and is there any in the room? Okay, we'll do Eric now. Question for Rachel with a trigger warning about Action T4. How do you feel about Disability History Month this year? Does this play into your comment on collusion?
Yeah, what's been odd around Disability History Month this year is there's barely anything about it. And that's not by accident. It's the same as in I think it's today actually, is the 30th anniversary of the Disability Discrimination Act. And when it was the 25th anniversary, we had like a week of programming on the BBC. There's been nothing. And it's all very, very deliberate. And for a long time, I had a strong warning. I had a strong rule that I would not talk about Action T4 because it's very triggering. And of course, disabled people know about Action T4. We don't need reminding every single day that what the government is doing is exactly the same as what the Nazi government did to disabled people. But it's one of those things where you can't avoid it now. Like, there is no way that, like, I hate to say it, there's no way the government didn't learn from that. Like, it's absolutely disgusting. I'm really sorry Rusty has just took this moment to show his dissent against Action T4 as well. No, but it's very deliberate, and it's the things that are being used in the media, it's the things that the government have done specifically, and it's every single day, all of the shit that comes out about mobility, which is so ridiculous, but also just not important. But then when you drill back to why are they going on about mobility, it's because to change mobility, they'd have to change the rules of PIP, which is what they were unsuccessful in doing in the summer, which we stopped them from doing. So it's like, oh, that's what you're doing. And it's just one of those things where, so in my book, I used the death by welfare timeline, and on the day that they were, and I understand some people may be for assisted dying, some may not, but on the day that the assisted dying vote happened, I was reading Peter Lilly, who was a Conservative MP, he was the Minister for, which eventually became DWP. I was reading his Tory conference speech in 1992, where he reimagined the Mikado, which is a speech about killing people who deserve it, so like murderers and, well, sorry, I shouldn't have said that. Killing people, like, so it's the Grim Reaper, and he's taking people out like murderers and rapists and stuff like that. But he reimagined it as people on welfare and single mothers and immigrants and massively disabled people who he says are faking it. So reading that on the same day that the majority of MPs voted for a bill which would make it legal to kill people for people to die who feel like burdens, it was so obvious seeing how we've gotten to where we are. And it's one of those things where once you see it, you can't unsee it. And it's terrifying. I really wish there was an answer, and I really wish I could sit here and go, here's what we should do to stop this. But it's one of those things where it's hard not to feel hopeless right now. It honestly is. I wish that was more positive to end on. I'm sorry.
I think we still have. Did you have a comment?
Yeah, I just want to echo just a couple of things Sam and Rachel both said in recent comments of just. So you were saying earlier. You were saying about about not your one's racist dad or whatever, right?
Yeah.
This whole issue, and I think
it's not my racist.
Not your no.
It's not my racist dad.
And there was a comment about generations before and spaces and things. And just, I think it's important to remember sometimes that, just as refugees are not responsible for collapsing public services and declining wages and, looming and current actually existing war and looming conscription and et cetera, nor are people waving the St. George's cross responsible for that either. It's the hedge fund managers, it's the bourgeois state, it's the bankers and their agents and government and so on. And I think it links to spaces as well. I don't really agree with the concept of left-wing spaces. I agree with working-class spaces. And I think these are what we've lost: community centres, youth clubs. And this is a major reason for the rise of that things like the culture wars and the kind of rising far-right politics can take root, because people don't have space. You can't have a community. You have to have community without space for that community to exist in. And there's a massive absence of non-commodified spaces where people can be without having to constantly spend money on food or drink or something, or be at the house of someone that's big enough to accommodate, people. And even there, you're not going to meet strangers really. So, squats or just taking space is a very, very powerful thing. And any revolutionary movement is built through liberated areas. That's how it works, and so that needs to be the kind of concept, I think, of taking autonomous working class spaces, liberated areas. It doesn't have to be in the form of a squat, there's other ways of trying to get hold of spaces. But because these things are not being provided anymore, we were only ever given these things as a very temporary sticking plaster in a specific constellation of class forces in the world, with the Soviet Union, with powerful trade unions, with national liberation, with all of which have gone, right? So we're not going to, that's not coming back, We need to take those things for ourselves as a matter of urgency. That's what I'd say.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's funny, that reflects something Joel Taylor said on the opening night about you can change anything in a space that loves you back. It sort of changes the tone of things. I think we have time for one short final question. Yes, go for it.
Thank you all very much. I spend a lot of time organising with different groups. It's a significant part of my life and paid work. And what we often find in different groups is to get people over the threshold into organising is actually quite a big ask. This is free labour. It's emotionally demanding. Yeah. It's complex. There's often a lot of conflict, even within groups. Mm-hmm. But I often invite people to do one thing. So if you could offer all of us one positive action that we can take out into the world to make that positive change, or a little bit of homework, aside from buying the books and reading them, which we all will do. But like, what would be your like one, takeaway? Rosie, do this, and you're going to get a big tick in helping to change the world in a positive way.
I think mine is the changing language. So changing the way you talk about different things, because I still think it's a lot, even well-meaning people, that you'll still hear them say things like wheelchair-bound, or you'll still hear them use really out-of-date terms for certain races or even certain sexualities and stuff like that. So it's being really conscious of changing your language yourself, but also at the same time just casually going, oh, do you mean this? When it can be quite hard that can be quite challenging, again, especially if it's definitely not my racist dad, to go, do you not mean this instead of that, And I think as well, it's challenging when you see it in the media, and it can make you feel like you're the naysayer, and it can make you feel like you do naught but complain on social media. But calling out even the smallest thing that you find insulting or racist or ableist or whatever, calling that out is probably the easiest action you can take. Like, it's just a simple, a matter of just a tweet going, that's the wrong language, you need to learn better. And that's quite a small one, I think. Yeah.
I would say, well, I just choice between two things. I'll narrow it down to one. If it's for an existing activist, my one thing would be to try to make sure whatever that it is you're organising, the space, try and have it at front and centre, to have it a place that is not a hostile environment for working class people and marginalised people of all sorts, including disabled, including different migrant cultures, working class youth and so on. Because I think that the lefty spaces often are middle class white culture that's just very alienating to a lot of people. And I think just really having that in the forefront of your mind is a way that we can actually try to transform our movement into something that's actually based within the masses. That would be my plea to the movement, I think.
Yeah, 100% second that. What's that quote from? I forgot who wrote it, but you have to turn what you have into what you need. I really love that quote. And in that kind of spirit of building strong organizations, I have a friend who always says that, whenever someone decides to be an activist, they never envision that being about washing dishes or cleaning a room, And so I think there's something about finding that those organizations or those groups or those unions that have the potential to be that kind of resilient group, and doing whatever it is you have to offer to that group, even if it is just washing the dishes, And pouring that into it. If I would have to pick one specifically, because that's something that I've been through. If I don't consider myself to be an activist, but I wanted to be involved with something that felt meaningful in that way, and where I try to put that energy is Living Rent, which is the tenants' union in Scotland. I'm sure people are aware of, but talk about a group that's around this kind of material need, this kind of struggle that just recently achieved a huge victory in the Scottish Parliament. But at the same time, I'm involved with my local branch doing member defence on people who get rent increases or evictions or whatever, which is like a tiny thing in the whole picture. So I think finding those strong, resilient, long-lasting organizations and plugging whatever it is you can do into that, I think is the most meaningful thing we can all do, if that makes sense.
Oh, perfect. I think in our conversations we've seen a good balance between the need for both the material and the structural in terms of our resistance work, both in terms of the institutional as well as the interpersonal, in some ways the literary as well as the documentary. And I think it's a good space to start in our ways of thinking about resistance to come. A writer who's very close to heart called Roxana Costali always ends by talking about our dreams and aspirations for the future. And I think dreams are a component of each of your books. I know Janet writes about her memories of doing splits in front of her Aunt Joyce when she was young, and how that dream was no longer something that she could imagine because of the loss and the grief that she felt. But that loss itself fueled that resistance. I know that, Rachel, you've written about how the loss of dreams is something that disabled people have to encounter and deal with on a day-to-day basis. And Sam, you wrote of dreams in a very helpful, hopeful register on how these stories of resistance are good patterns and lessons that we can draw from. And I think moving forward, that's where we need to focus our efforts into a politics of hope, into institutions of hope, into direct action that is hopeful and kind. Thank you all for joining. The Radical Book Fair is an explicitly incredible space. Make sure you buy incredibly large amounts of books, give all of your money away, and leave here completely broke. See you all soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Q. While these lovely people make their way off the stage, we're going to have a signing table up at the back by the bar. So if you didn't get a chance to ask a question and you wanted to, then you can do that there, or you can get a book signed. And a wee reminder that we have a pay-it-forward system. So people with money have put money behind the till for you if you do not have money to buy a book. So if you're broke, you can still already get the book. Just tell us you want the book on Pay It Forward when you're at the till. Thanks again for coming out today, and hope to see you through the rest of the fair. Thank you.